Hello, I'm Toby Jurovics, Chief Curator and Holland Curator of American Western Art at Joslin Art Museum, and I want to welcome you to this virtual tour of fact and fiction and contemporary photography. Before we begin, I want to say a special thank you to all of our lenders to the exhibition, and also to our sponsors, Douglas County, Omaha Steaks, Mutual of Omaha, and the Robert H. Storrs Foundation. I also want to send my best wishes to you and your family, and I hope everybody is safe and well as we work our way through this very difficult situation together. Fact and fiction looks at the variety of ways that photography navigates the complicated visual landscape of the 21st century. And as a medium, it's got a very short history. It's only about 180 years, but in that span, it's reinvented itself several times. So let's take a look at a very abbreviated view of its history. Here we go. An early image, 1844, by William Henry Fox Talbot, the inventor of the negative-positive process. So this is a paper print made from a paper negative, and here we are today with Instagram. Images made with this little device here. The estimate is that 1.5 trillion exposures or captures will be made because of that little thing we carry around with us. And what do we do with these? We take pictures of what we had for dinner, what we had to drink, dogs and babies. Photography finds itself in this very precarious position, in many ways, kind of a victim of its own success, more ubiquitous than at any point in its history, but in a certain way has become kind of more temporal and almost say kind of lacks a certain degree of permanence. The other crisis that we have really is one of believability, that more often than not, when we look at a photograph today, it's presumed to have been manipulated or altered in some fashion. I'm going to take us back to this photograph by Henri Cartier-Bresson behind the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris in 1932. Nobody believes that this moment didn't happen, that the photographer caught this guy right at that point when he's jumping from that walkway, kind of trying to get over this puddle. As a matter of fact, it originally appeared in a book called The Decisive Moment. So, photography's truths have always been a little bit slippery, but for the most part, most of the time, for most people looking at an image, the photograph is presumed to be a truthful depiction of what was in front of the shutter at the very moment when the photographer kind of clicked the shutter. Why does it matter? It's a photograph by Robert Frank, Trolley, New Orleans, 1955. It's published in a book called The Americans. And I wanted to read a comment that was made in the obituary section last year when Mr. Frank passed away. And somebody wrote, Robert Frank's Trolley, New Orleans photograph is so perfect in composition, framing, exposure, background, and reflections that if it were taken now, I would suspect some heavy digital enhancement and fakery. That's why I so enjoy emulsion prints taken directly from negatives, much more than I do the too perfect digital images that are everywhere these days. Sure, you can fudge a lot in the darkroom, correcting exposure problems with dodging and burning in, but a print from a negative is a true image of a moment in time. I don't trust digital photography to be that. So that's what the issue has really become, is one of trust. Can we still rely on a photograph to offer the same insights and revelations, and do we still believe them? So how do photographers find this balance between what our expectations of photography were and how we encounter the world around us today? So let's start with first photograph in the exhibition, John Divola on the occasion of my 60th birthday. John has always been something of a trickster. First of all, shouldn't the photographer be behind the tripod? And there John is, spying at us, spying back at us from within the frames. We've got a pair of binoculars that he's holding up, looking directly at us. But also, this photograph undoes that idea of the decisive moment. And we can see a third of the way through the exposure, the sun suddenly comes out from behind the clouds, and then it appears to sort of drop back in, and the rest of the exposure is again in shadow. How does John do this? Well, the tripod is actually supporting a robotic arm that takes a simple point and shoot camera and creates a grid of images across the frame that are then stitched together to create a single photograph. And in this way, what he's really doing is kind of taking apart that idea of the decisive moment, kind of pulling the rug out from under these expectations. Adjacent to that work in the gallery is this piece by James Casabir, Library 2017, and it's based on an actual space. It's a library in Mexico City designed by the architect Luis Barragan. So we're looking at, though, a facsimile that's been created out of foam core, museum board, plaster, styrofoam on a tabletop in the artist's studio. So kind of there's 2 degrees of separation, and it exists only to be photographed. Why would he do this? Allow us to concentrate on the beauty and serenity and solitude of this space, what Barragan talked about as emotional architecture, and in some ways to kind of be able to think about that without the distractions of the real. There's no furniture in the room, there's no kind of sense of human presence, and to just concentrate on kind of the architect's purest intentions, but kind of recognizing that the best way to do this is almost through this kind of recreation of a model. Julie Blackman's new chair at first seems like a pretty typical family snapshot, but then the more you look at it, you realize it kind of rings almost too true. The colors are so saturated, the profiles are really sharp, the off-kilter perspectives sort of give away the illusion. And what I'd say is it all rings a little bit too true. And you can see how bright the lawn is in this chair, and it almost feels like these various kids have been kind of snapped into the frame, almost like you're creating a jigsaw puzzle. Blackman said she's the oldest of 9 children and the mother of 3. She says these images are both fictional and autobiographical and reflect not only our lives today and as children growing up in a large family, but also move beyond the documentary to explore the fantastic elements of our everyday lives, both real and imagined. So kind of creating this fictitious space and using the characteristics of digital photography kind of create this hyper reality. Larry Sultan kind of also creates a sort of hyper reality, and another very different version of domesticity in his series The Valley. And what we have here is this rather ambiguous narrative. There appears to be this kind of studio lighting, this kind of dramatic lighting in this scene, and there's a narrative, but we don't really know what it's about. Throughout his career, Sultan wasn't kind of committed to the idea that he had to be the one who clicked the shutter. He often used anonymous photographs from corporate or government archives or frames that he selected from his father's home movies and his images. Here, he's working on the sets of adult films in San Fernando Valley, where he grew up in Southern California. And what he's capturing is this moment when families would rent their homes to be used as sets while they went off on vacations. They went skiing or go to the beach, and for 5 days, a film crew would move into your home and create these films. And for the film companies, it kind of gave this veneer of kind of authenticity. But I think that what we're also looking at here is this kind of implication that much of daily life might also be kind of a performance. And this idea that you never really know what's happening behind the neighbor's front door. And so they are at once both real and recognizable, and yet again, something that seems just not quite right as we look at them. Lala Sadie's dual portrait asks this very critical question: is it a portrait if you can't see or recognize who the person is? She was a native of Marrakesh, and the studio that she set up is an unoccupied house that was owned by the photographer's family, and she was often sent there as punishment when she was a child. She's using her personal history to reflect on gender inequality in this traditional society and how men and women navigate public and private spaces. So the calligraphy that she's handwritten on the backdrop and on the gowns that these women are wearing is a sacred Islamic art form that was traditionally considered to be only the purview of men. by taking ownership of this tradition and eliminating the opportunity for the male gaze. She's using her photographs to kind of assert and create new social rules for women. Carrie Mae Weems has always been interested in historic and contemporary political and social dynamics and how those impact our understanding of race, gender, and sexual identity. And these photographs were also staged here with students from the Savannah College of Art and Design. And she's looking at pivotal moments from 20th century history and posing her collaborators in front of the camera to connect them to these moments of social unrest and political upheaval. And here, this is a recreation of the arrest by the FBI of the political activist Angela Davis. And here is a photograph of her being apprehended in 1970. And it's sort of drawing on, again, this idea of, creating what seems to be an image that might have appeared, appeared in the newspaper, or might have been kind of flashed on the television screen, and trying to connect us back to these very critical points in history. The landscape, as we see in the exhibition, has also become highly politicized. This is a work by David Taylor and Marcos Ramirez Eyre, and you can see this galvanized steel monument that they have created and placed along what the 1821 border between Mexico and the US Western Territories. So we see here, it originally ran along the California-Oregon border before dropping through Colorado and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And what they wondered was, what would Mexico and the United States look like if that boundary had been fully realized? And they want us to consider the meaning of these political borders, their disconnect from how topography normally shapes boundaries, how topography defines the landscape, and how these, what really are artificial boundaries, are used to define notions of citizenship, immigration, and social responsibility. The idea of social responsibility weighs heavily on the work of Trevor Paglen, who considers himself both an artist and an investigative journalist. And here he's concerned with unveiling the military and political systems that operate just out of our sight. What seems at first like a kind of desert, kind of evening desert skyscape, I guess we would call it, seems fairly innocuous until we notice making its way just out of the frame is a Reaper drone. Paglen trades on earlier imagery in American art, in particular the luminous painters, and we think about Fitzhugh Lane's views of the brilliant skies over the East Coast Ocean, over the Atlantic Ocean, or here in our own galleries, Albert Bierstadt's The Trappers, Lake Tahoe. But instead, it becomes a much more ominous and even threatening image. And the Reaper drones are armed unmanned aerial vehicles that are used by the United States and their allies. They've been used heavily in Afghanistan and Iraq, and again, now along the US-Mexican border, and kind of weaponized that like a war zone. What Paglen wants us to ask is, once we recognize what's in the sky above us, what's just out of sight, can we ever kind of exist again without the sense of being watched, being surveilled? And does it change how we feel when we look up into the evening sky? Looking at another work here by James Casabier called Sea of Ice. And this is, again, a recreation in his studio, in this case of a painting by Caspar David Friedrich. It was called The Failed North Pole Expedition. It was 1823, 1824. And in the original painting, set up against this these crushed ice sheets was the wreck of a sailing vessel. In the 19th century, Sea of Ice would have been understood as a depiction of the sublime, of the experience of awe or terror or danger in the face of nature. The 21st century version suggests something far more terrifying, a world where sea ice no longer exists other than in a painting or a photograph. And Casabier's image really asks us to ponder what that future might be like, where the only place that we would be able to have this vision of the Arctic is if we create it in a studio, or if we look at it in a photograph. Simon Norfolk, working with Klaus Steinman, is considering similar issues. This is a, you can say a kind of a constructed image, but one that the artist came across. There is a man-made ice grotto that's been carved into the Rhone Glacier, and it's been a tourist destination for more than a century. The family that owned it has covered the grotto in these thermal blankets. And we can see them going all the way back around this glacial tarn. And we've got this kind of cinematic lighting, and the artist is using a studio light that's suspended from a drone, kind of light this scene, and again, creating this rather mysterious narrative, almost as if we've happened upon kind of an abandoned theatrical production. And Norfolk writes, "The gesture is as forlorn and doomed as the glacier itself. There is something insane about trying to reverse the inevitable. It is as if the glacier has wrapped itself in preparation for its own funeral." And you'll see that as we look at the next image as well by Dan Holdsworth, this idea is really a preoccupation of landscape artists today. I would only point to the fact that the weekend that this exhibition opened in February was 65 degrees in Antarctica. And so it's really impossible to go out into the landscape today without having this kind of consciously in the back of your mind at all times. Dan Holdsworth's photograph, Argentière Glacier, from a series called Continuous Topography, is made also in Europe, in the Jura Mountains between Switzerland and France at the base of Mont Blanc. In this case, it's created from thousands of individual measurements made in collaboration with a geologist that are taken from digital captures made, again, by a drone flying over the glacier, and the result is a point cloud. It's generated by a computer program. It correlates these GPS coordinates into a three-dimensional model of the landscape, and the artist calls this future archaeology. And you can see, again, this negative, if we want to call it that, was created in the computer before being exposed onto the paper, and you get a sense of the profile of the glacier, but also this very three-dimensional feeling that you're almost kind of standing within that landscape. And what Holdsworth wants us to do is to imagine kind of various scales of time, from the geologic eons that it took to create the mountains and to form this glacier, to the instantaneity of the digital age and how quickly images can be made and how quickly our lives seem to progress these days. And he said, "I want you to imagine a future with or without humanity's overbearing presence." And this become obviously both very, very critical and very sobering thoughts, particularly at our current moment. Sitting across from this in the gallery is an image that's made in exactly the opposite fashion. This is by Thomas Joshua Cooper, Midnight Sun, Freezing Fog, the Barents Sea, Day 1, Nordkapp, North Cape, Finnmark, Norway. This is the furthest northernmost point of the European continent, gazing out over the ocean towards the North Pole. And what Thomas is asking us is, can a landscape be at once specific and anonymous? You know, when we think of a landscape photograph, we think of topography, we think of the recognizable. We want to consider an Ansel Adams view of Yosemite Valley. We all know what Half Dome looks like. What happens when we take away that recognition? This is part of a series called the Atlas of Emptiness and Extremity that tracks the entire profile of the Atlantic Basin, going from the coasts of Europe and Africa to circumnavigate Antarctica, working along the eastern seaboard of North and South America, and then through the Arctic, and kind of mapping, instead of looking at the land, looking at the ocean, and creating this visual map of that space in the middle. And he asked us to look at his photographs almost and kind of close our eyes and try to imagine what it would be like to stand at this exact point, when you know that the next thing that you could see hundreds of miles away, the next kind of topographic, cultural, or historic point is the North Pole, and standing behind you, kind of the weight of the entire European continent, both as a physical presence as a cultural presence, as a historic presence. And in a certain way, what his photographs inhabit are the space between the literal and the emotional and the imaginative. Susan Rankaitis' work do that as well in a very different fashion. And her work kind of undermines this notion that the subject of a photograph needs to be immediately recognizable, and that instead it can be mysterious. She builds her images from multiple layers of negatives, from objects placed directly on the print and exposed to light, and then works with dyes and chemical toners and hand-applied pigments. Her subjects have traditionally ranged from things like the aerospace industry and technology, to medicine, human biology, and to recent work addressing climate change. In this piece here on the left, called Sung in Climate, what we see is the root ball of a tree from her garden that died during an extended drought in Southern California. And yet, even in this very tangible artifact of the physical world, it's kind of cast in an ambiguous space that seems at once cellular and planetary. So the viewer's eyes, as we look at these images, we kind of scan the surface, veering from kind of the recognizable here to the abstract, in search of a sort of a foothold from which to begin to unravel the meaning of these images. The last image we'll look at by Megan Riepenhoff, Ice Number 17, is also a photogram, in this case, a cyanotype print. And the cyanotype is a process that dates back to the 1840s in a gelatin silver print or a black and white print. Silver is the light reactive agent, and that creates that black and white or gray tones that we are accustomed to. Here, it's an iron pigment which turns blue when exposed to light. And each sheet of this triptych is about 3 by 5 feet. And Riepenhoff coats these in her studio, takes them out into the landscape, and lays them at that intersection between land and sea, in this case in a bay in Washington State. And the landscape itself becomes the negative. What we're looking at here is the impression of water and ice as it washes over the prints that are literally kind of laid out in this kind of this kind of literal transition zone, literal L-I-T-T-O-R-A-L, that transition between earth and between land and water, and really looking at that very physical presence of the landscape. So the majority of the photographs in this exhibition kind of carry that appearance of transparency and immediacy, of arresting that scene as it appeared before the lens at that very specific moment. But they also remind us that things kind of aren't always what they seem. So looking at this variety of techniques, from images exposed on film and printed in a dark room and kind of what we consider a kind of traditional photograph, to compositions that were assembled from multiple digital captures, cameraless photograms, the artists in this exhibition subvert our assumptions about their subjects and the manner that photographs are created. So exploring these traditional genres, still life, landscape, portraiture, their work has really challenged this understanding of photography's role and how we describe and understand this changing world around us. Thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing you again in the galleries, and I also thank you for your ongoing support of Joslin Art Museum.